I think we as a society are obsessed with only honoring that people need help when they reach a stage of complete and total shutdown, when you're no longer able physically to carry that load anymore. First of all, that sucks. That's super invalidating and but also sometimes it doesn't look that way for people. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for coming back if you've been here before, or hi, welcome if you're new. My name is Mickey. I'm a therapist and we talk about therapy things on this channel. Today we are talking about burnout because if you have been here for a minute, you will know I've had my own journey with burnout. But also I think in, with the current state of affairs, it's becoming a more and more relevant conversation to have. So we are talking about what burnout is, who's at risk for burnout, what burnout actually looks like, and how to heal from burnout today. Before we get into that, I want to be super clear. All of the content on this channel is intended to be broad strokes learning and education. This is not about individual therapy. I cannot therapize you over the internet. That's first of all impossible, and second of all, it's illegal to try. So we're not doing that here. If you are a person who is struggling from burnout and needs a higher level of support, there are always links in my description to find therapists, including ones that are focused on being affordable and accessible. So please feel free to utilize those if you need. But we're going to talk again from an educational point of view today about burnout and all of the things. So I'm excited to get into it. Also, if you like my shirt, I don't know if you can see it, but this is my official merch. I made it myself and I'm very proud of it. There's a link in my description, both to become a patron and to buy my official merch. And we just launched a sticker shop that I'm very excited about. So go get some merch if you like my shirt and you want to buy it. Okay, thanks. Okay. All right. So, I think at the top of this conversation, it's important for us to clarify what is burnout. To be clear, burnout is not a medical diagnosis. There's not like a DSM diagnosis or like a code on the ICD-10 for burnout necessarily. It's more of a cultural phenomenon that has become really prevalent, especially as, a lack of work-life balance is becoming increasingly common. So that's important to clarify. But typically, burnout tends to come along with an exhaustion, both physically and mentally, but also a general feeling of hopelessness, of feeling overwhelmed, of feeling like there's not really a lot of gas left in your tank. I do have an official definition from the Mayo Clinic here, but again, I want to be clear, it's not a medical diagnosis, and so there's not really like specific terms for what burnout is. Mayo Clinic defines burnout as a state of physical or emotional exhaustion that also involves a sense of reduced accomplishment and a loss of personal identity. So this is where we see the apathy and the hopelessness. Along with this, though, we can see a sense of compassion fatigue and irritability. Sometimes people who are burnt out will notice themselves having a shorter and shorter fuse. They're more easily overwhelmed or irritable or irritated. There's also a sense of fear, sadness, chronically being tired and hopelessness, and just like the general overwhelm like we talked about. There is also a lot of literature describing burnout existing solely as a phenomenon related to work, which personally I disagree with. We're going to talk later, actually in a quick minute, about who is at risk for burnout and what risk factors there are for burnout. And I think it would just be disingenuous to discuss burnout only from the perspective of existing in the workplace, because we know that human beings don't just function at work. Our lives at work don't exist in a vacuum, and I think it's silly and disingenuous to assert that what's going on in our social lives, in our relationships, at home, in all other aspects of our life doesn't also influence the way that we feel and the way that we're functioning generally in life. So I want to talk about who is at risk for burnout. There is some stuff. I'm going to link all of my sources in the description, but in there is an article or like a piece of research that describes the sort of state of affairs in terms of research around burnout as a phenomenon, that speaks to the coining of the term, which happened in the 70s, I believe, that again, first of all, described burnout as a specifically work-related phenomenon, but also spoke about how burnout was related to the helping professions, people in social and human services. Later in the 90s, this was rejected because we know that people who work in a variety of fields can become burnt out. But there are some demographic features or shared characteristics that do put a person at increased risk for burnout. So I want to go over those. The first thing that I want to talk about is a general societal obsession with efficiency. People will fall in different places with their desire to be an efficient and productive person. But again, I think it's just silly and disingenuous to not acknowledge, especially in America, our particular fixation with being efficient, with winning, with being productive. And especially folks who view productivity and like winning through the lens of efficiency tend to be at risk here. What I mean when I say that is that folks who view winning or being productive or like being successful as like not enough, meaning like it's not just enough for me to be successful, I have to also be successful as efficiently as possible. This creates a particular vulnerability to burnout because that pursuit inherently flies in the face of meeting our own needs for rest and for fun and self-care and those types of things. Along with this is the gifted kid syndrome. I'm planning on making a whole video about this because it's a very interesting cultural phenomenon in my opinion. But for the sake of being succinct, what I am referring to are people who grew up with this attitude that you are like the gifted kid who was like put in like the special classes and whatever, or also just kids who were sort of celebrated as the golden child, that like you're great, you're so smart, you're the overachiever, you're the winner, you're exceptional, and you were celebrated for going above and beyond because that became part of your identity. This is also a risk factor here when we talk about burnout because essentially burnout stems from prioritizing work, productivity, efficiency over our, inherent need for self-care. Having this particular like identity or like characteristic puts us at risk here because we can learn from a very young age that the way that you're celebrated, the way that you're valued, and the way that people care about you is when you go above and beyond. And so not only is it an expectation, but it's the way that you feel valued and worthy in this world. And especially in context with capitalism, which we're going to talk about in a hot second, and the way that the workplace is structured to manipulate and exploit folks who have this particular leaning towards, like going above and beyond, that can be a recipe for disaster when we talk about burnout. It's really, really easy to become manipulated by a a workplace into going above and beyond and not being compensated for that, either with like vacation time or extra money or whatever, because again, we have this kind of like almost like a childhood wound around being the person who goes above and beyond and is exceptional and is the star. Because we just talked about capitalism, we'll talk about it now. Again, it's just disingenuous to not acknowledge the elephant in the room, which is the way that capitalism steals our identities in some ways by telling us that a lot of our worth comes from being a good worker, right? While I don't believe that burnout is solely a work-related phenomenon, I think a fair amount of folks start to experience burnout because of our workload and not being compensated, not feeling like we have enough hours in the day to do all of the things that we need as people for ourselves, while also meeting the very, very, very high expectations that come along with having a corporate job and like, working a 9 to 5 and like all that kind of stuff. Also of note in this area though, is sexism and misogyny. Women, AFAB people, femme presenting folks, the usual targets of misogyny tend to experience a higher risk factor here because of the way that sexism and misogyny informs cultural expectations around our identities. Oftentimes there is the message that these folks are inherent or natural caregivers, right? And not only are you a natural caregiver who it just comes naturally to you to want to caretake other people, but also that work is so fulfilling and so life-giving that you should be thankful that you get to do that. And so not only are you a person who should feel this natural draw towards it, and you should be doing this all the time, but also because it's so fulfilling to be a caregiver to your spouse, to your friends, to your coworkers, to your children, to your loved ones, it shouldn't tire you out. It shouldn't bother you because it's just part of who you are. This is obviously a crock of shit, but also is like particularly manipulative to folks who have grown up with this as part of their identity. There is, this is like breeding grounds for feeling overwhelmed and feeling like you're drowning while also not feeling able or empowered to express that to folks and to ask for that change to be made. This is really important for us to acknowledge when we talk about burnout, and why I said I don't believe that burnout is only related to work, because this attitude existing in one's relationship or one's family life can very much compound with high expectations at work, high expectations for ourselves, and just generally feeling like there's no fucking time for me to take care of myself, to meet my own human needs. And so that's when we start to tiptoe into burnout territory. I think it also goes without saying that folks in the helping profession, medical or healthcare workers, therapists, social workers, like social services, human services people, are also at work here, kind of for similar reasons that folks who are affected by misogyny are, because there's this attitude that like, well, you're helping people. Isn't that so fun for you? you. And also you should want to work overtime. You should want to do extra, and you should want to do it for less money because the work is just so fulfilling. You should just be so thankful that you're, chopping off little bits of yourself to help other people all day, every day. And that's, again, a crock of shit, but also this very manipulative and exploitative attitude that does very much exist in these helping professions. Along with that is the issue that comes along with being educated to become a member of these professions. In one of the articles that I put in the description, they speak about how there's like a joke in med school that the process to become a doctor involves all of the things that are like the antithesis to health promoting behaviors, like staying up late, being malnourished, or overworking yourself, like those types of things. And this is also like very common in this field. So that creates a risk factor there as well. All of that to say though, while these people are like particularly at risk, or these like identity factors tend to create an increased risk, anybody is susceptible to burnout. This is not a thing that just exists for particular people. And it's a thing that we should be discussing about like awareness around and prevention around, because again, it can happen to anyone. And I think it's becoming increasingly common with the way that things are. Okay, so now that we've covered that, I do want to talk about the phases of burnout. When we talk about burnout, I think oftentimes we see the representation of like the very last step. Like what it looks like when someone has officially reached chronic burnout. But there are a lot of like warning signs along the way that I want to discuss. First of all, because I think it's good from a prevention point of view, because if you're in the early phases, it's a lot easier to heal and like move yourself back out of it. But also because I think it's important to just educate around generally that burnout looks lots of different ways and can come along with lots of different things that we as a society have just sort of deemed as normal when they're not fucking normal. So there are 12 stages in this model that I'm using. If you look up like the stages of burnout, there's a whole bunch of different things, because again, it's not a medical diagnosis. There's not really a universally agreed upon set of stages, but these are the ones that I think most closely mirror what I have seen in my clinical work, what we see demonstrated in the research, and also what I just as a human experience. So stage number 1 is the compulsion to prove oneself. This is the stuff that we just talked about with feeling a desire to go above and beyond, to feeling like a shame about like, I occupy these identity factors, and so I should want to caretake others, and it shouldn't exhaust me to caretake others. We already talked about this, in context with the workplace, but this makes it really difficult for folks, like having this compulsion makes it really difficult for folks to say no to someone who is overreaching, who's violating your boundaries, like a boss, but also even just people in your regular life. If you struggle with wanting to go above and beyond for folks, it's going to be hard for you to set those boundaries and to be clear about what your limits are, to preserve that time to take care of yourself. Step number 2, or stage 2, is working harder. This is, sort of similar in the vein that there usually is like a glorification of like, I work harder than everybody else here, or I do more for our family than anybody else does. I care for my friends more than anyone else in our friend group does, right? Like I'm the mom of the friend group. While this is, rooted in a kindness and like a desire to be there for others, it can very much become problematic, and it can also be weaponized against us, particularly in the workplace. But I think, again, it's just worth making note of, because this is one of those things that we as a society are like, oh, it's perfectly normal. And like, what a good person you are for eschewing your own needs for the sake of being there for others. And that's not healthy. That's not what healthy boundaries looks like. And this is why it's like on the journey to burnout. Number 3 is neglecting needs. This is the thing we talked about, like the joke with like going to med school. But this also looks like, especially as parents or primary caregivers, not having time for yourself, time to go be with your friends, time to be fucking alone, sleeping enough, nourishing your body enough, moving your body, having like the general self-care things. Neglecting those needs is part of the journey to burnout, because what happens is that along the way of trying to be this person who overachieves, this person who works harder than everyone else, this person who feels valued and seen by being that way, something has to give. And usually the first thing to give is our needs, the things that we want and need for ourselves. And usually the things that we as a society see as luxuries, like free time, like fun, like going out with our friends, like, doing fun self-care, silly things. For parents, this looks like date night or time alone, or time with your friends. But for, like students or like, people who don't have kids or whatever, this looks like social time, time away, time alone, time to go do fun things and hobbies and interests, things that are purely for pleasure and leisure that we as a society have sort of labeled as like, it's extra. If you get to it, you get to it. But if you don't, who really needs it? And like, you do. Humans do. Humans do very much need these things. And when we start neglecting them, that's when we start to tiptoe again into this territory of like losing ourselves, and starting to feel burnt out. Okay, stage number 4 is displacement of conflicts. This essentially, again, I'm going to link this whole write-up so you guys can read it word for word, but essentially what we're talking about is an avoidance behavior, especially if someone is sort of calling to your attention that like, hey, I've noticed it's been a while since you've taken care of yourself, or like you don't seem like you're okay. When we get to this place, usually we're just like, I don't want to talk about it, right? Like, don't call my attention to that. I'm not open for feedback about this. And oftentimes the verbiage around this can look like, if I don't, then things will fall apart, or I don't have a choice but to keep doing the things that I'm doing, right? If I don't finish this project at work, no one else is going to do it because I work harder than everyone else, remember? And my identity is built in being this person who overachieves, and I've neglected my needs to get to this place. And so, of course, I'm going to fucking finish it. So no, I'm not open to your feedback about how maybe I'm neglecting my own needs. This can sometimes come across as aggression, but sometimes it's just straight up avoidance of like, no, it's fine. I don't want to talk about it, right? This is worth noting if you're seeing this in yourself, but also if you're seeing this in your loved ones. It's not to say that we should be aggressive. Don't be aggressive with your loved ones, but holding a kind and assertive space to say like, hey, it is okay actually for you to not do that project because like, who gives a shit if it doesn't get done, right? It's okay if your house doesn't have clean floors this week, if that means that you have time for yourself. It's okay if you don't do thing X, Y, or Z, if that means that you're showing up for yourself because you're important, because I love you, because you matter, and you're allowed to want to do these things for yourself. Thing number 5 is revision of values. Essentially, this refers to shifting your perspective to value work and productivity and efficiency over, the things that you need as a human in your life. Sometimes people use the term Stockholm Syndrome. I don't super agree with that, but like it is sort of a similar energy that we have, usually it's subconsciously that this happens. We're rewriting our value system to prioritize work and efficiency and all of that so that we don't feel this sense of disconnect or this sense of like non-matching when we talk about like not meeting our own needs, right? We start to almost like gaslight ourselves into saying like, I don't need these things, right? I don't need to sleep. I don't need to have free time or leisure time. I don't need to have hobbies. I'm fulfilled by doing this. This is what matters to me. This is my identity. And so I don't need to bother myself with the details of these very important and very human things because I've rewritten my value system to prioritize these things that are leading me to burnout, but we don't really see it like that in the moment. And so along with that, thing number 6 is denial of emerging problems. This is, again, kind of the energy that when things start to fall through the cracks, when it starts to become obvious that a person is no longer able to keep up with this absolutely unsustainable workload, there is a lack of willingness to address that as a problem, to talk about that as a problem, or for like feedback about how that's not working for us anymore. This is either like self-denial, where we're not acknowledging it in ourselves, or in community when the folks who love us are trying to call our attention to this. But the core is the same, that there is a turning away, like a very intentional turning away from the way that this is negatively impacting us. Again, usually this comes from a place of shame and guilt of like, I can't not do this. This is my identity. I am fulfilled by this. And so there is just like this really concerted avoidance of how this is negatively affecting our lives, which leads us to stage number 7, which is withdrawal. If you are noticing either in yourself or in a loved one that you suspect has burnout, that they are less communicative, they're less engaged, less involved, either like socially, but also just in general communication, like responding to text messages, being open to phone calls and stuff like that. This may be a part of that, because having folks draw your attention to the way that your workload and like way of being is is harming you, you know, we talked about there's this intentional denial of that. And so withdrawing serves the purpose of, first of all, creating more time because I don't, you know, I'm not socially engaging anymore. So I have more time to focus on like the productivity things, but also so that I don't have to confront these difficult conversations or to look at the lives of other folks who are prioritizing themselves. And that makes me feel sad about not having that time or that leisure. So I just won't look at it. I'm going to withdraw. I'm going to seclude myself into just me or just my very core community of people. And again, continue to run headlong into this productivity, this efficiency, this like really high workload. This leads us into stage number 8, which is odd behavior changes. This can look a lot of different ways. I don't know that I super love the characterization of it as like odd, but this can look like staying up at hours that like someone typically wouldn't, like staying up into the late hours of the morning to work on stuff, becoming a person who is like particularly fixated or obsessed with efficiency and organization and stuff like that, but also just a general divergence from the way that a person typically is. If you or a loved one is typically like a fun, happy-go-lucky kind of silly person, and you start to see this loss of that and this more somber attitude, that can be a red flag that we're starting to tiptoe into burnout territory. Especially if we're seeing someone just have like a general lack of joy and desire to engage with joyful and fun and silly things. This is kind of what we're talking about with that like behavior change, that like the staying up late and the efficiency and all of that is like very much a warning sign, but choosing to avoid or withdraw from like the fun and joyful parts of life is a warning sign for actually the next step, which is depersonalization. I really don't love that we're using the term depersonalization because typically when we use depersonalization in a psychotherapy context, we mean like the bird's eye view, like viewing yourself outside of your body, dissociative kind of way. This is not that. What this refers to is a person failing to see themselves as being of value. This is when we start to get into like the late stage burnout where we're really losing the joy and like the light in our eyes kind of stuff. This is where the hopelessness and the sadness starts to set in. When we lack a feeling of value about ourselves, it again fuels us towards the place of burnout, but also distances us from our core community, from our safe people, and from all of the things that are protective factors against burnout, which are the leisure activities, which are the self-care, which are like the fun and joy and like silliness. Stage number 10 is inner emptiness. This is what we were talking about with like the loneliness, the sadness, the like general hopelessness. This tends to happen because we've withdrawn, because we're lacking in the time and availability and emotional bandwidth to participate in our lives in the way that we used to. It's important at this stage to also note that we're not necessarily talking anymore about like an intentional desire to distance. It's more so that a person is just genuinely lacking in the ability to be that way because we're so consumed and because this really, really high unsustainable workload has sucked the life out of you. When you feel this inner emptiness, it's not because you're choosing to believe that you're empty or because you're choosing to be lonely or alone rather. It's because this is like a culmination of all of these risk factors all piling up on top of each other and now creating this thing that feels insurmountable. So not only do I feel unable to let go of this workload, not only do I feel like my identity is wrapped up in this workload, but I don't like it. I don't feel good anymore. And now I feel stuck and lost and hopeless in like, I don't know how to let go of this. I kind of want this, but I also don't. And I just feel really, really bad. And at this point, we start to feel like other people are no longer relating to the struggle we're going through. We feel unable and a lot of shame and a lot of fear usually about communicating this to the people in our circle, our loved ones, because it creates that feeling of loneliness and like people don't really understand what I'm going through. And so on top of the fact that some people may have tried to warn me about the burnout, and I have shame about that, I also now feel like you don't understand. And so it compounds that feeling of loneliness, which leads us to stage 11, which is depression. This is where we start to get into the very, very late stage burnout where things are just feeling very hopeless, very sad, very overwhelming. And this is typically the stage that folks experience a lack of care for the work that we're doing anymore. This is why in like the helping professions it's particularly of note because we can experience compassion fatigue and a sense of apathy around the work that we're doing and a sense of hopelessness. Oftentimes folks who are in this stage of burnout will say things about how like it doesn't matter anyways, like it's just another day, like it is what it is. These kind of like resigned attitudes towards the work that we're doing that at one point did feel fulfilling. Now it just feels like this very depressing and sad and monotonous work that ultimately adds up to nothing, which we know is not true. But again, when we get to this place, we've had so many things compounding on top of each other that it's starting to drown a person in this feeling of like shame and overwhelm and sadness and hopelessness, which then turns into stage 12, which is burnout syndrome or full burnout. Oftentimes this is described as like a complete and total shutdown, both emotionally and physically. I don't know that I love this, to be super honest, because I think we as a society are obsessed with only honoring that people need help when they reach a stage of complete and total shutdown, when you're no longer able physically to carry that load anymore. First of all, that sucks. That's super fucking invalidating and shitty. But also, sometimes it doesn't look that way for people. I think we can tell ourselves oftentimes, like, I'm not burnt out because I'm still going to work every day, because I'm still showing up for my kids, right? I still have to get out of bed. So no, it couldn't be me. I'm not burnt out. And like, maybe you are. It's just that you've developed a really uncanny knack for being able to push through the physical and emotional limitations that we often see described in the literature as being like, oh, of course you could never move past this. But like, sometimes people do, and you are still very much fucking burnt out and still very much in need of help and support. Like, at all of these stages, to be clear, but especially at this one, even though it might not look like the way that it's described popularly. So I know that's a lot, and that can feel a little bit depressing and sad. I want to talk about burnout recovery. Before we get into this, I do want to clarify, though, burnout recovery, in the same way that burnout symptoms are unique to the person, your recovery will be unique. And so while I am describing like general trends that can be helpful, please know that the things that you will need will be directly correlated to the things that caused your burnout in the first place. So being able to take stock of what led you down this road, what particular combination of risk factors influenced this trajectory, will be very helpful to you in your specific case. And that is very much work that you can, and I would argue should, be doing with a therapist. And that's why this content is not therapy, can't be therapy, because you'll need someone who specifically understands the nuance and the details of your life and your situation so that you guys can effectively address that. Along with that, I want to caution folks against making a systemic issue your personal responsibility, because the reality is that burnout is very much a byproduct of our capitalist obsession with productivity and efficiency, and our, again, like misogynistic and sexist leanings towards folks who are, typically affected by that. And so there are risk factors at play that will influence our ability to recover from burnout, and that's not your personal responsibility. While of course we want you to recover and to feel better, it's not to say that it's just up to you to like find the right combination of self-care and push the right sequence of buttons and then you'll fix it, right? We really should be acknowledging that there are systemic issues at play, and that it's not your responsibility to fix those, and it is okay if you have a hard time with negotiating burnout recovery because of those. There's also a thing I'm going to link in the description that speaks about some general research about burnout, that talks about burnout recovery and how making personal changes in our own individual lives, typically from a CBT place, whatever, can show some efficacy in addressing the burnout symptoms, but that the most promising change that they saw was when folks were changing stuff about their individual personal lives, and that there were changes being made to the workplace. Again, this is why I said we should not be holding ourselves accountable for making systemic changes when they're not ours to make, because the reality is that if your workplace is not on board with making changes that are conducive to burnout recovery, that's not on you. Like, that's not your fault, and you can't do anything about that. It's not to say that you can't recover from burnout, and it's not to say that you can't experience an improvement in your quality of life, but also be kind to yourself that you may not be able to influence some factors of this situation, and that's not on you. Also, I've noted in the research is that we saw that real recovery can take sometimes more than a year, and so this attitude that like, oh, I just need a weekend off, I just need a short vacation, probably not, especially not if you've reached the late stages of burnout. You are very much going to have to make a concerted, consistent, regular effort at recovery for a very, very long time, especially if you're not able to take time off of work, because we live in a capitalist society that, exploits us and forces us to trade our bodies and our labor for the right to survive. That sucks, and that's not your fault. And so it is okay for you to take the time that you need, and also like be patient with yourself, because again, if there are factors at play that are working against you that you have no control over, that will influence how long it takes. And again, that's not your fault. When we talk about like concrete steps to take for how to heal, again, I want to encourage folks to be aware of the underlying causes that cause the burnout in the first place. Is there a particular issue that's happening for you in your workplace or in your relationships or in your family life, or for you as a parent or for you as a student or whatever? And noticing that, trying to trace back along the way how those things affected where you ended up ultimately in burnout. That's going to be really key work for us to address and to take note of, and to make those changes around. The other thing about this that's really important to acknowledge is that burnout recovery and like healing generally really is done in community, ideally. Like this is the best way that we can heal ourselves, is by having a community of people who are on board to help us do that. And I know that finding community can feel really intimidating and overwhelming, but it's not to say that you don't have community. Even community online in digital spaces can be very valuable. And so I just want to encourage you, if you have safe people, if you have any safe people, practice communicating about this with them. Community doesn't have to look like a close friend group of like 12 fucking people. It could be one person. It could be just your mom. It could be just your sister, your best friend, your neighbor, your cousin, your classmate, whoever, so long as they're like consenting and comfortable with you sharing about that, obviously. But don't pressure yourself to do this thing where you're like sharing about it with like a huge group of people. Community meaning like don't shoulder this burden alone. Don't pressure yourself into not talking about it because you're afraid of being a bummer, because you're afraid of, like embarrassing yourself or being, like a Debbie Downer. You are allowed to talk about it. And I would argue that it is very important for you to talk about it with your safe people. And also, people who love you want to support you. They want to be there for you and they want you to be honest with them. If your friends only like you when you're happy, they're not your real fucking friends, and you deserve better fucking friends than that. I think there's also an important caveat here, though, that family and partners or romantic partners and like our relationships could have also contributed to the burnout. So there may be specific changes that need to be made in those relationships in order to prioritize your healing. So again, this is work that we need to be discussing with a therapist or like a safe and trusted objective person to help you make those changes and to help advocate for yourself in those relationships. But generally, again, I just really want to drive home the point that healing and community is so valuable and really goes a long way in us feeling safe, us feeling heard, and us feeling worth doing the work. The last thing that I want to talk about in terms of like specifics for burnout recovery is learning how to reclaim our time. Especially in this capitalist world that is obsessed with stealing our time and our attention. Reclaiming our time is an act of rebellion and also an act of self-love. Learning how to say no to extra work obligations, to overtime, to projects that we're not getting paid for, to extra stuff just generally that we don't want to be doing is such a flex and such a skill and like so important. Also, it's work that we all will have to do regardless of whether you occupy any of the risk factors that we talked about earlier or not. Learning how to say no is a very difficult thing. It's not embarrassing or shameful to need help with, also just for the record. And so practice learning how to reclaim that time. Again, not for things that are like productive for your healing, but just for things that are joyful, things that are fun, things that light you up and that stir up your insides and that make you want to get out of bed in the morning. Those are the things that are going to be really helpful when we talk about burnout recovery, because what you need to do is practice like centering your personhood, not as a worker, not as an employee, not as the service that you provide to others, but as a human being who deserves to just be and just exist in this world exactly as you are, and who deserves to feel delighted and excited by just living your life. So this might look like silly little hobbies. This might look like fun time with other people. Whatever that looks like for you, I want to encourage you to chase after it, so long as you're being safe. Be safe with yourself and with others. But practice incorporating that as a regular part of your life. And again, a therapist is a great person to help you figure out the particulars of how to do this. Also, just as a quick last little aside, I want to encourage you to prioritize your wellness in the pursuit of doing it because it's just worthwhile for you, because you deserve to feel that way, not as a chore, not as like I need to recover from burnout, so I'm doing steps A, B, and C. Prioritize that wellness and chasing that fun and that joy because you deserve it, because it's fun, because it's just worth doing in and of itself. Again, not because it's part of your to-do list or your checklist, because that's like the opposite of the work we want to be doing with burnout recovery. So I know that this was a lot. I want to encourage folks to take this with a grain of salt, consult with your own individual therapist therapist about what's going on for you, and to honor your own nuance, your own life, because again, I'm just a stranger on the internet who's yelling at you about burnout. I don't know about your life. I'm sure you're lovely, but unfortunately, I don't know anything about your life. So please feel free to take what works, leave the rest, and really honor your specific situation and the nuance that exists for you. Because again, I'm sure that you're lovely and you're wonderful, and we all deserve as human beings to feel happy, to feel healthy, to feel okay, to just generally have fun while we're here. So if you like the video, subscribe to the channel. We do talk about stuff like this, but we also talk about more fun pop culture things. So I'd love to have you stay for that, and share the video to help the channel grow and to help each other grow. And I will see you guys next Saturday. Okay, bye.